Hello and welcome to um, the latest session of the On Philosophy lecture series. This is the beginning of a special week where instead of just being on a Monday, as it normally is, we are doing events every day, Monday through Friday. And it is in celebration of the fact that the Philosopher, which is the journal that organizes these events, has just published a new issue. And the topic, as you can see, is what is we? And it looks from many different perspectives at this very contemporary question to do with the formation of groups, the nature of division, the nature of teaching people how to understand the formation of we. It looks at lots of different um, angles. And I'm really delighted that for the event, I was going to say tonight, but actually for the three speakers, it's this afternoon. We have Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan, who is a professor of English. Kiara will introduce her shortly, but back in spring, Ragini wrote a wonderful little essay called What is We? And I decided later in the year that we would turn it into an issue, exploring that question from more angles. And I was also delighted that Brooke Holmes, who is a theorist and historian, who also contributed a piece earlier in the year, agreed to write a lead piece picking up on Ragini's question, what is we? And they both open the new issue. So I'm really extremely happy that Ragini and Brooke have agreed to take part in the event tonight to open the week's series. And for the second time in the series, I'm really delighted that Chiara Ricciardone is going to be the interlocutor. Chiara is the US commissioning editor for The Philosopher and has been a great inspiration for the direction in which the journal has gone, as well as being a really wonderful person to work with. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Bard College, working in the Hannah Arendt Center. I have a feeling it's something a bit more than that. But anyway, it's something like the Hannah Arendt Center. And she writes a super column for the journal called Liquid Philosophy, of which we're looking forward to the second installation in the new year. So I think the format will be that Brooke and Ragini and Chiara will be in conversation probably for about 30 minutes, following which we will open it up for questions from the audience. Please make your questions reasonably short so Chiara doesn't have to read too much, and please send them to the Q&A bit rather than the chat bit. I'll be sending a few bits of information out via the chat bit, and obviously if there's any feedback, anything you want to say, send it to the chat bit, but if you want a question asked, please send it to the Q&A. So without further ado, I think I'll hand over to Chiara to introduce Ragini and Brooke.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you everyone for coming and taking some time out of your day to participate in this conversation. I really miss being able to see your faces, so I wanted to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat and maybe tell us a little bit about what we's you identify with or affiliate with, or maybe what draws you to thinking about this question today. By way of introducing Brooke and Ragini, I wanted to do something a little unconventional. You will have seen their formal bios, which I will also post in the chat, and they're very impressive. But let me tell you something you don't know, right? So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the we's that bring us together. So Ragini and I, one of our we's is that we were graduate students together at UC Berkeley in the Department of Rhetoric, which is an unconventional department because it brings together people who do things like post-colonial literature like Ragini and things like Greco-Roman classics like me, as well as many, many, many other things to the side and in between. So the rhetoric department has a kind of we problem to it. How do we say we of the rhetoric department? So that's how I know Ragini. Brooke and I, I've also had the privilege of knowing Brooke for quite some time. And right now, Brooke and I are in a professorial we. We are co-teaching a class together with Daniel Padilla-Peralta at Princeton and Micah White of Activist Graduate School. And the class is called Rupturing Tradition. And an edited version of it is going to be available online for free open access, thanks to Princeton University. So we teach together, and I also had the privilege of being part of Brooke's Post-Classicisms Network, which is a project she ran for some time. And as I'm thinking about it now, there's actually quite some similarities between the Post-Classicisms Network and the rhetoric department. Both draw on a number of different theoretical fields and take as one of their goals trying to push those fields forward. As for the three of us, we are all Americans, and so the US election is very much on our minds today. Still, all of us are academics, although in very different sorts of ranks and institutions. We all have young kids, and we are all writers, I would say, is something that's actually important to me. Both Ragini and Brooke wrote for the issue that I guest edited in the spring, in particular a section where I asked them to respond to the question, what question should we be asking? And the three of us, we're here in this room. We think this question is important enough. We want to talk about it with other people. It is the sort of question that really requires multiple voices to start to get a fuller perspective on it. So I hope that you are introducing yourselves in the chat. Some of you, I'll try to keep an eye out over there for you. Brooke and Ragini, do you want to say a little bit more about we's that you affiliate or disaffiliate with that are adjacent to or outside of some of those affiliations that I just sketched?
So good, we need to appear now, I think. There.
Appear, welcome.
Hi.
All right.
Brooke, do you want to go for it?
I mean, I think that the question of the conversation right now, as Kiara was saying, we're all American, was highly, highly pressurized by the election. So for me, I think one of the challenges right now has been navigating between the kinds of we formations that I would have imagined myself to participate in under quote unquote normal circumstances, and all the ways in which this election sort of magnified a sense of nationalism, which had been an academic concern and increasingly became a kind of pressing lived concern intersecting with the question of having a child in a public school. So those we's feel very both raw and real and also almost unthought because they're so intense. So I think I would just flag that.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know that I would add at the outset a different we's. I am feeling very much part of the we of the professors, the teachers, the unique experience of being a teacher in a closet, which I don't think is my experience alone right now. Having young children, and also being a writer who thinks a lot about different kinds of audiences, different modes of collectivity, different addressees, and being someone from an interdisciplinary space like rhetoric, which Kiara, you talked about, I think really appropriately. I might have a chance maybe later on to say more about a term like post-colonialist, which you somewhat appended to me, which is another term that I would both embrace and chafe against, which I think is for me a big theme of sort of the we question or the we problem is it's the thing that you have to have and you also have to sort of push it away. I don't know. I mean, I'm really grateful to Anthony and to you for inviting Brooke and I to answer these questions and to respond to your initial question, right? What question should we be asking? I think one of the reasons why I wrote the short piece in the beginning a few months ago was because all of us in this sort of era of resurgent nationalisms seem to be asking the question, who are we? What kind of people are we? What kind of people do we want to be? Who are we not? And so forth. But the we needed to be further problematized. And so anyway, it's just such an exciting thing to be able to do that with you both.
Yeah, I was recalling that one of my earliest formative experiences in graduate school was trying to explain some idea very excitedly to somebody at a graduate school party. And I was saying something about, we think about history this way and we think about temporality that way. And of course I got back the response, well, who is we? And in that context, it's really the classic academic takedown, which is a request for specificity, a request for don't too quickly generalize your ideas outside of a context that is really important to understanding them. But the way that you asked the question, Ragini, I think is something really different. So you're saying it's really important to ask this question for you because it's both aspirational and a problem that you chafe against, and something about it made you ask it in this particular way, not who is we, but what is we.
Yeah, I think, when you asked us to think about questions, two sort of things were in my mind. One I already said, which is that we are in this moment, and I'm not talking about the election as such, but I think we've been for quite some time, which is why in the essay I wrote, I made reference to the Bush presidency, the George W. Bush's second term and so forth. I mean, this is not exactly a new question. Of course, the question of nations is a very old question. But I think there's been a lot of, for lack of a better word, soul searching about identities, about the role of identity politics in politics, about the kinds of collectivities we want to have, about whether or not the global and the transnational and the cosmopolitan are salient categories anymore, whether or not we are in an era of authoritarian nationalisms or populisms, right? There's been a lot of effort to sort of name this thing, this moment, our people versus other people and so forth. So I had a lot of questions about that. And of course, certainly for the Americans in our audience, this is what we're now adjudicating again. What do the election results mean about who we are? But I just want to say very briefly, the other thing that was in my mind, and when I first penned this very short piece, was the work that I do specifically as a teacher of literature. And literature is such an important and central tool for collectivity building and rupturing. And I specifically teach post-colonial, ethnic, and multi-ethnic literatures, which means that in a classroom, we're always dealing with things like the we that the text describes, the we that the text is addressing, the we of the students in the room, the we of the future readers, right? The we of the past readers. And these are not the same populations, and they vie for a certain kind of legibility and recognition. And I wanted to, again, put pressure on what it meant to think not about who we are, but what we is as something we desire, as something we push back against, right? We want to be seen, we want to be recognized as belonging. At the same time, we want to be quote unquote ourselves. And yet we are, and so forth. I mean, Brooke, I know this question has meant different things to you and you've taken it in new directions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back the distance between the issue from the spring and the issue now, where, what I was really thinking about in the spring was this claim that Deleuze makes for ethics, where he says, ethics will mean this or nothing at all, just paraphrase, not to be unworthy of what happens to us, which he's taking from the Stoics really, and trying to make sense of this weird conjunction between determinism and forms of historical determinism, and then the ethical space of not to be unworthy of what happens to us. And what does that mean, not to be unworthy of what happens to us? And one of the things that I was struggling with was, even when Deleuze says, ethics means this or not, nothing at all, not to be unworthy of what happens to us, he's really speaking about an us as a pluralized set of individuals. But I was really sort of using both the challenge of that claim and then the question of history to think about I's and collectives, and to think about all the ways in which I think of myself as a subject, both historically determined and then trying to, in a way, be accountable to what I come to know of that determination and past actions, almost in a kind of Zen sense. But then also, what kinds of collectivities do I belong to that need to engage in that kind of work together, and what would it mean? And so the essay in the spring was really already thinking of this question of scale, and the scale that I think a lot of us are struggling with now, that we're isolated in some sense in very small communities, and then we're in these very large diasporic communities via Zoom, which just exaggerate social media communities and these kinds of communities. And then we're trying to navigate the middle ground between some kind of massive sense of either cosmopolitanism or the Anthropocene or global politics or whatever, the West, and this very local kind of almost isolated we. And it's those middle grounds that I think I was thinking, what are those scales? And those were the scales that I think I was struggling with in trying to answer the question coming back around after the summer and thinking about race and thinking about the nation and thinking about school. And how do we sort of move between the kind of very local and then this huge sense of this history that we're all implicated in different ways, and that we somehow need to make sense of together while also accounting for these radical sort of inequities in terms of how we've been made by that moment. So, thinking about critiques of the Anthropocene as sort of using the notion of the anthropos to flatten who the we is. But at what level then do we stop when we say, okay, we want to introduce distinctions within this massive we? Can we go above the individual, but below the anthropos? Where would we stop? So for me, those were the kinds of the gap between the spring and the winter was really there. And I guess the last thing I would say is, as a classicist, or someone, I don't really identify, that's another question, the interdisciplinary question. I don't identify as a classicist because I think that one of the problems with classics, but also one of its promises as a form of knowledge is how it takes for granted a form of we. It constitutes an object of value, the Greco-Roman past, but rather than see that object of value as contested, or that we choose to value it, or that a we in a way isn't sort of given by the valuation of that past, that in fact, thinking about what the Greco-Roman world is as shared is itself a site for imagining these forms of we in the tenor of the universal or the West or the European or the diasporic or whatever. So that was also very much on my mind.
Mm. Yeah, so I think we're seeing already that there's so many planes on which we ask this question of we. Even the individual can be a kind of a we if we're all a multiplicity. And then going up from our families to the pedagogical professional situation to the level of the nation and all the way up to the level of the human or the beyond, or even beyond the post-human. So I hope we're going to have a chance to sit at each of those levels for a moment, because I think we should ask whether a we is constituted in the same way at each of those sites or each of those scales. But for the moment, let's take sort of a midpoint and a context which is really present. And I'm seeing that we have a lot of people from all over the world in the room with us today, which is wonderful and exciting and surprising for me. So I saw Mexico and Saudi Arabia and UK. So bear with us for a moment as we process together some of our national context and with the results of the US election. We're seeing President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris calling for unity and for healing after years that many have experienced as divisive. And in this rhetoric that is so present and loud, difference and division are positioned as the problem, as the wound, as something that has harmed the body politic. And yet the reverse is also true. Maybe people can imagine a time from your own experience where you felt hailed into a we that felt like a violent imposition, or you felt the need to step out and say, well, who, what we, or in some way distance yourself from that we. So when is it that a we is violent, and when is it healing? What's going on with this rhetoric? Should we be pushing this kind of rhetoric of healing and woundedness away altogether? Is it somehow really necessary for thinking about how we constitute a collective?
Can I say something briefly? I think you've already done so much work in just phrasing the question in that way, right? By saying unity is being posited as the good, division is being, posited as sort of what we need to get over. And I think those of us who are sort of deep in the postmortems from the US election, no matter where you're sitting in the world right now, know that the call for unity has itself been experienced as very divisive, right? Or a certain call to say what the American people have voted for now is healing. Which American people, right? Mm-hmm. I think that that is certainly something that we have to continue to flag as thinkers, as commentators, as pedagogues, right? That there are those who are actually strengthened and who are able to speak from a place that is, or speak sort of more boldly and more effectively from a place in which they are not, their identity has not already been collapsed into something else. I think I said that in a sort of convoluted way. But related to the conversation of unity and healing and so forth, is the way in which now we're trying to understand different voting blocks in the American population. And something similar is happening there, where we're trying to read what a particular population wants, the Latinx population, you know, African Americans, South Asians, Asians, and so forth. And there's a lot of, you know, important pushback on whether or not it even makes sense to think about some of these groups as blocks, as unified, right? Instead of as extremely heterogeneous, complicated groups of people who have some shared interests and some interests that are not shared, right? It's so much harder to think with that kind of complexity.
Yeah, and go ahead, Brooke.
No, go ahead. If you want to respond to that, I had a response to your question, but it was in a slightly different direction.
No, Brooke, take it in a different direction.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. That we do have these very heterogeneous views, and I think that again, like at what level do we process that heterogeneity, and at what point does the call for unity or healing feel coercive? And I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about is the fracturing within the Democratic Party that's been on display the last couple of days in the debates around or the blaming around the loss of the House majority, and really feeling that the sense of the progressive Democrats really turned out the vote, turned out Black and brown people, turned out young people, and then now are being told, okay, this we isn't going to fly. Like we're back under the kind of moderate we of the Democratic Party, because that's what we need to reach out to Republicans, right? And I think that kind of question of like, what are we going to concede in order to produce the form of unity is a really important question right now. And I was listening to the Brian Lehrer show yesterday, driving back from Princeton actually, and the last caller on the show basically said, well, are we going to concede that coronavirus isn't real? Are we going to concede that police violence doesn't happen? Like, what is this we that's reaching out for unity itself bargaining? What are the bargaining chips, I think, already? And it just made me think that part of the challenge, I think, right now is that what does it take for the we not to feel coercive? Well, it does require a certain level of consent, of work within the we. And the challenge is that I think no we wants to be determined through its pain. I mean that's a question. No we wants to be defined through a form of oppression. Or to assume that that's the desired outcome is, I think, too quick a step. But the ways in which you move too quickly to healing and the denial that there is a problem, it's what makes me think about is the ways in which communities are forced into attaching to harm in order to define themselves precisely because that harm isn't recognized in the call or the push for unity. And I think that's been, a real challenge, because it's at the heart of how identity politics is played out, is around harm, right, and suffering. And I think sometimes for me, what I've been thinking a lot about is, that can be very challenging insofar as it feels like a double insult, insofar as the harm isn't recognized, but the agency of that group is then also constrained by having to be defined through the object of harm. It's very narrowing and constraining in a way, and yet we're watching the conditions under which. What is the alternative to sort of give up too quickly and say, okay, let's move towards healing.
Yeah, I'm going to kick it back to you, Ragini, because this is reminding me of so much stuff that you've taught me about ethnic, what it is to be have grown up in an ethnic enclave, the minority position within America, the powers and the temptations. Anyway, yeah, take it.
No, there's so much in what both you and Brooke just said. One of the things I wanted to say, just to slightly, I think, maybe nuance my own position before I think your really helpful comments, Brooke, is that, right now, for example, there's the chafing against the assignment of desires to specific voting blocks, right? So just because I'm quote unquote Asian or Indian doesn't mean I am like everybody else. I learned some lessons about this. Kiara was just referencing the fact that I'm from the Bay Area, California. I did very much grow up in an Indian American immigrant community, and I have a long-standing relationship with Indian American and South Asian American ethnic media. And I edited, before I went to graduate school, an Indian American magazine, and I'll try not to make this story too long, but I came to that work as a public writer, addressing a broad immigrant public, as someone sort of trained even at the undergraduate level in deconstructive and post-structuralist critiques of identity and community formation. And I came sort of, with the vocabulary of something like cultural theorist Ray Chow's work on coercive mimeticism, right? I was ready to sort of be the embattled Indian who could be something other than Indian and who wasn't just going to produce a version of myself that was legible in a multicultural America and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying, I know I'm probably sounding a little like I'm making light of that language, but actually what I mean to say, it was very much the enabling condition of the work I wanted to do and did, editing ethnic media. But what I learned also was that it's much more complicated, right, than saying I edited an Indian American magazine for Indian Americans. What I immediately learned was that Indian Americans didn't exist as such, and that in every moment of addressing them, I was bringing them into being. And that there was again this sort of very dynamic way in which the people who were writing for us and the people we were reading were never quite the same people. We didn't know who we would be when the journal was, circulating, and I started to think, I think, in more complicated ways about community. And I say all of this to get back to some of the questions about the election, because I think what it made me realize was that our identities, minority identities, seem to be attached to things about being attached to, questions of injury and harm, as you were saying, Brooke, but they're also importantly enabling conditions and places from which we can speak. So the sort of Latino voting bloc that is not, for example, a Latino voting bloc because of its internal plurality, there is also a way in which, I'm not speaking on behalf of any such voting bloc, but the hypothetical ethnic voting bloc potentially has more power, right, if it did speak as one, right? Or if it could learn to speak as one when it needed to. And so I think, so harm can be transformed, right? But the question is when, and with it, inviting whose voice into the conversation and so forth.
Yeah, so part of what you're saying, it sounds like, Ragini, is there can be, sometimes a we is an invitation and an anticipatory proleptic one, as in you're writing for India Currents, you're trying to bring something into being. And then in the case of the Latinx voter bloc in the United States, it's something more like a they that's been imposed. People that are Cuban American, Dominican American, other places in South America and Mexico don't necessarily, in fact, very few of them identify with the term Latinx, and it's very much an externally imposed they. But if there could be a strategic, you've introduced this term strategic essentialism from Spivak,
yes.
There's a power to be had if one can strategically appropriate or enter into an affiliation like that. It becomes about really a question of power and not a question about harm. Yeah. That possibility is there.
And I mean, if I could just, I think what I'm struggling with is the ways in which it's precisely that question of the conditions under which a we forms and the conditions under which that harm is productive and when it becomes constraining. And I guess what I was trying to say is there's a way in which needing to focus on violence can mask the enormous political agency that has been exercised by a number of, individuals, collectives, organizers, unions, I mean, people of color, like in this election. And that's exactly what I don't want to do, is say, this is just a question of grievance. It's not. It's actually the effacement of that political agency at the moment the Democratic we says, now we're going to unify, now we're going to heal, as if it's in their voice that the political agency is going to be exercised. And so I think, I'm thinking Jacqueline Rose had a piece in kind of the height of Me Too, which I really appreciated in the LRB about, the kind of split identity that I could identify as a woman around the ways in which I don't want to be defined as an object of sexual violence or someone who can never exercise consent. But if I'm working under conditions under which every violation is going to be somehow a form of consent or coerced version of agency, that's also really, those are not equal conditions of equity. And I think that I really appreciate that essay, because it was that the question of harm, I think, can't be decided once and for all. But it's that we, I guess, to go back to your original question, Kiara, is like, what if you had asked, okay, is this a moment of healing? I think that question is sort of, well, we can't paper over the real violence and harm that produced this political moment. And it's not to say that that should define everything, but that was a site for the exercise of political agency. And that political agency and the fight and the amazing strategic work that came out of it needs to be honored in the political vision going forward, rather than these calls to somehow go back to a vision where we were all bipartisan.
Yeah.
So you're bringing me to the question that I think is like just the subtext of what we're talking about. And it's the place where both of you end your pieces in this issue. And both of you end with a kind of a call for remaking a we. And it's very suggestive, but it leaves one wondering, well, how do we do that?
Yeah.
What are the processes involved in doing that in such a way that navigate the challenges that we've been talking about?
I have maybe a very short answer. Sorry, go ahead, Kiara. You're going to complete your thought.
Oh, I was going to say, it's okay if we have more questions about that than answers.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any answers as such, but I just, you brought up Spivak earlier, right? And this question of the strategic use of essentialism, which of course is something that has been much debated in post-colonial studies and feminist theory and related fields. And so one of the things I wanted to say about what do we do with this question? What was the word you used? Not redeem a we, but how do we sit with it now? I think there's this question of one of the things I was trying to write about was what it would mean to pursue we even as we think we is doomed to fail or something like that, right? Like, how can we commit to the necessary failure of the we? And I mean, I guess I could have said that slightly differently, right? Like, what would it mean to put forth we as a horizon that we, to which we move, but we can never reach? But I think the language of failure is instructive. And I think I take it from people like Mark Chang, who I cite in the piece, who's an Asian American literary and cultural theorist, and also Spivak, right? Who talked about strategic essentialism and the use of essentialism that you sort of can't not use, right? Like, you can't not speak through identitarian terms, even as you also have to disavow them so that you don't trap yourself and the other, right? This is, I think, you can kind of hear the disciplinary stamp and probably the years even in which we were, Kiara and I, at least we were contemporaries, we're in school, have a lot to do with what the particular theoretical currents have been in the last 15, 20 years, I think, in the American Academy. But I think, and I'm trying to make a connection back to Brooke's very important comments about agency and autonomy, the commitment to failure, right, is something I think we've been thinking about a lot in terms of other things like the Anthropocene, like the spread of global English, like new phases of global capital, right? Failure also might mean something about giving up certain visions of the future, right? Giving up certain visions of the human, giving up certain ideas about representation, right? And its possibilities, its political potential, and so forth. So I think those are actually, so I guess I just want to say, I am there thinking about many different fields of scholarship that are trying to think about failure actually as a way forward, or giving something up as a way of getting something else, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so, I really resonate with that, the emphasis on the kind of failure, the kind of, performativity and the enactment, the notion of enactment that comes out in your essay, Ragini. I mean, I think that in a way, maybe the answer to the question, Kiara, is how, it's easier to say how not to do it. And, I feel like I was looking at Thomas Szabo's essay in this issue about feeling together, which was interesting for me to read because my day job, as it were, like what takes up my time when I'm not teaching second grade is this project on sympatheia. And I think a lot about we, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about with this, looking at the emergence of this word sympatheia, feeling together, in the Greek and then the ancient Mediterranean context, is precisely how it emerges in the context of the body and the soul as a organic unity. It's really at the site of imagining organicism. And then it's the way in which the organic body becomes the model for imagining a community, a political community, and a cosmic community. So, and you can see an inkling of this in the Republic, where Plato says, what will be the proof of the fact that the citizens are together, are a unity, a fused collective or corporate body in the city, is they'll feel their pain and their pleasure together. And the Stoics will take this up to say the fact that the whole body feels the pain of the finger proves that there's a unified body. So, you know, if the philosophical problem is how do you have unity if you don't have a mereological atom? A mereological atom has no proper parts. It's just, you know, it just is being, right? If you're going to produce unity in heterogeneity, sympathy is put forth in a kind of way to prove an underlying relation. And I was thinking a lot about that, looking at this kind of, you know, discussions about affect and sympathy now, because of course they function in this way in the 18th century, the age of sentiment, to produce a notion of the human, the notion of human rights. And it kind of clarified for me again, like, you know, any unity presumed in advance, and particularly the ways in which we naturalize that. And I mean, you know, we see that in biopolitics, we see this around race, you know, but I mean, any kind of way in which we think of the organic body as a unity, you know, is a problem. And I think that's what Latour is talking about in Facing Gaia, is how do you think of systems biology without projecting Gaia nature as a unity? So, you know, in a way, that notion of enactment is super important. And I'll just end by saying, you know, what I struggle with is, to go back to what I said at the beginning, is the question of scale, because like this is a we for me. Like this conversation is making a we, the ways in which at the beginning, Kiara, you talked about the very particular ways in which we're connected. I mean, in my essay, like I do a lot with this book, The Last Samurai, which is about, you know, a woman teaching.
I love that book.
You know, the reason I'm using that book is because Kara and Mahajan, who Ragini knows, you know, and it was my neighbor at the Coleman Center and gave it to me for my birthday. And I love that book, but it makes me think of him too. And it makes me think of the ways in which we form these communities through very sort of contingent, but intellectually deep bonds that make we's, that traverse all kinds of barriers that we think, I mean, you know, that's not a kind of natural we in some way, but, you know, there's a we of thought, there's a we of thinking together and talking together. And the question is, you know, what kinds of how do we scale that up? And I do think that's why I come back to art and literature and culture, not because it proves a humanity that already exists, but because it is a site for imagining these collective investments and at scales beyond always the seminar, you know, I mean, they can sustain larger communities, I think.
There's so much in what, yeah, go ahead.
No. I had something to say that might be slightly perverse, and I actually don't know where it goes either. So, but maybe since I've started saying it. No, I mean, I love this, you know, the idea of like the fellowship of readers and everything that you were talking about, Brooke. And I just wanted to sort of add anecdotally, and sort of by contrast, one of the things that gave me pause in the last few years when I was trying to think about, say, critiques of ethnic representation and so forth, was stuff that was coming out of bone marrow registries about how we really need people from our communities, and I put the sort of our in you know, the quotes, to sign up for bone marrow registries, because we are more likely to find donors from quote unquote our own communities. And I've been thinking about this for a long time as a way in which sort of biology or the natural or the organic or a different kind of connection cannot actually be ignored, even as we professors, humanists, readers, writers, I think maybe tend to privilege the other kinds of we's, the reading we's, the citations, and so forth. I don't know if I said that clearly enough, but it's just something that I have been trying to think about, even as we sort of to sort of give more emphasis to the textual and discursive.
But it means something that even though those modes of making we that might be closest to this particular we, which are thinking and writing and art making, that we're using those to try to reach out to people who might not actively participate within that we, and go beyond it. Many of the questions that I have here are coming up also in the Q&A. And so I wanted to shift to some of the questions from the people that are here with us around the world. And maybe just because we have been talking a little bit about Brooke was talking before about sympatheia and the organic body, and it was thinking about biological notions of the human. I wanted to turn to the question of the Anthropocene. So Amanda Lia, and forgive me in advance to everyone whose name I butcher, it comes out of limited knowledge, not out of any desire for ill intent. So she's asking, on a global level, the virus has challenged the notion of the Anthropocene in that we as humans aren't so separate from our environment as we believe. How might we begin to think and move past this barrier between humans and the natural world and to start including non-humans in our sense of we? And I would add, is that how can we, and when is that necessary, maybe? Brooke, I'm thinking about your work on the post.
I know what I'm thinking, something when we were talking earlier, and I'm going to repeat it though, because I think it does kind of speak to this, which is, I don't see the virus as completely challenging the notion of the Anthropocene. I see it as the ways in which forms of interconnectedness and complexity, but also, the ways in which we are producing, anthropogenic change are all ways in which our quote unquote agency is exaggerated beyond what we can control. And that's why I do think sometimes that Greek tragedy is a good way of thinking about this, because it's about the ways in which we're not innocent, right? It's not, the gods aren't completely just coming in and doing something, but we do things, Pentheus acts stupid, he acts, but he comes back a mangled body, and Agave says, or I can't even remember if it's Cadmus, he says, you're inhuman to Dionysus. Dionysus is like, I'm a god, right? And there's a way in which the way, climate change comes back to us incorporates that what looks to us like cruelty, but which is indifference to human ends in the magnification of our effects. And I think that's where we're grappling, because we want to restore political agency and ways in which, the virus is affecting communities of color much more, seriously because of social factors in access to healthcare in the US. But there is also a way in which it is an indifferent agent. And so that's where I think, Latour, Haraway, or those networks, I always think Haraway was doing this before, but these networks of braided forms of agency produce models that we're not completely able to deal with, but then on the other hand have always been there in societies that are thinking about, that's indigenous cosmovisions or Greek tragedy, or ways in which we've never had such a fine line between nature and culture.
Can I just say something about the premise of the question that I think is in line with what Brooke said, which is that I think I'd also agree that the virus doesn't really challenge, the initial part of the question was about challenging the premise of the Anthropocene, right, Kiara?
Yes.
I think, and I took it from the question that the questioner was suggesting that there's something that we cannot control, right? And so therefore it challenges but I think that my understanding of some of the Anthropocene stuff, and Brooke, your knowledge is much deeper than mine, is that, it actually, in thinking about human beings as geological agents, right? We are, there's a way in which the virus actually maybe, I don't know. I think I'm just going to repeat what Brooke said in worse words. So let me stop there. But anyway,
I would respond to that person that, and I think it was Amanda. One thing I think is interesting with the virus and the questions of we is that it has the potential to redraw boundaries. So at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, there was talk of, I'm in New York State, there was talk of forming an Eastern bloc of states, and they were going to coordinate border crossings and things like that. And so the redrawing of borders, both within and along national lines and also changing national lines, but also the borders between the infected and the infectable, which is this invisible kind of but there's also the participation in mask wearing or not mask wearing in America is a fraught divide that signals something more than. So I think that the virus is giving us a lot to think about in terms of what kinds of we's and that it's, although it's invisible for that reason, having an interesting effect on we thinking that has been till now most recently dominated by visible markers about race and gender and those kinds of categories. So I appreciate the direction of that question, bringing another dimension to light. To shift to back to the political US context scale, keeping with this idea of scales that someone asked us to keep in mind. Alexis Papazoglu from London says, hello from London. My question is whether a we always requires a they in order to be defined. Trump's politics were defined by narrowing the we and expanding the they. Even if the next chapter needs to go back to expanding the we, can it ever escape the need for a they? Many thanks, Alexis. Thank you, Alexis.
I think that's really, really important question. And we could have a whole conversation. I imagine this will happen over the course of the events this week about the relationship between we's and they's, between we's and I's, we and us, and the sort of internal plurality and singularity of each of those categories. And I think, part of the problem with, of course, we had the conversation earlier about unity and division, right? Is that the we, I think the we does presuppose the they. There's a way, there's at least one way in which we becomes kind of meaningless if it has no outside, right? If we is coextensive with everybody, we could think about that as a thought experiment, right? If we is everything, does it have any kind of sense or purpose, right? Can it actually do any work? I don't know.
I'm laughing because like Plato's Timaeus in a way sort of tries to experiment with the idea of an organism that has no inside. And then there's this question, but it's an organism, so it has to eat, and it basically just eats its own shit. And that's like, it's like Plato's attempt to imagine a living thing without an outside is a really interesting, anyways. I've been thinking a lot about what that means, but I guess in a way, what that points to is what I wanted to add, Ragini, is I think that, that you do need a they, but there's, I think, another added question of the they that is like the Cold War they versus the they of the immigrant. And, there's this debate about, modern, is biopolitics ancient or modern? And clearly the ways in which conceiving of the state as a population or as a living thing that then has, potential rot within or something that needs to be exterminated, and essentially is actually, I think, an old notion of ways of imagining we as well, that somehow there are internal hierarchies that allow, say, the human to be achieved. I'm thinking of Aristotle's way of defining the human with, the natural slave or with the woman, or these categories within that are they within, that somehow is allowing the fully fledged we to emerge through this kind of internal division. And so that's been on my mind also because of Zakiya Jackson's new book, Becoming Human, where she's really looking at the animality discourse isn't just about Blackness and animality, but is about the discourse of the human that has an internal animalization of Blackness. And I think that's such an important distinction when we think about we and they, of how these two things work together. But I don't know how, it's a big question. That's all I could add to it.
Yeah, I think it maybe just to voice what Brooke and Ragini are saying in a different way, it matters what we mean when we say we. So it's possible, like, for example, what female used to mean something different than it does now. So it's possible that we can learn to say we in such a way that we all take for granted when we're saying it. This is unstable, this is precarious, this is temporary, this is optional, opt-in. And so that it's, although there may be an us, them, or a we, they implicit in saying we, it can be a more fluid one. And so the option there is, yes, it comes with a they, a defining outside, but it's not an oppositional outside. So there's ways of redefining what it means to say we that also then therefore redefine what it means to say they. And I think it's actually really weird that, or really important, not weird, relevant that there's a shift going on in all the pronouns that we are using now, that there's a shift in gender pronouns, that they can mean a singular person, that is going to have an effect on what it means to say I, and what it means to say we, and what it means to say all those things. So identity politics isn't just a game about, voting blocks and things like that. It's having a profound effect on the really elemental core of our language, and how we think about ourselves in relationships to others. And so I'll just read a comment from Reed Gomez that I think speaks to this and also brings in something about the Anthropocene. Reed writes, A relevant play on words, we need something else, quote, something else. There are important ways of conceiving a we that understands community that are not centered on humans or coercive assimilation, singularity, such as Navajo, Yoemi, etc. The very something else that cannot even be named, seen, or heard, despite the complication of voting in US elections. And I'm sure there's more to say there and more to learn there. I think he may have posted a book in the chat that may be of interest to folks. So thank you for that, Reed. Since we're getting lower on time, let me pull out another question here of so many possible questions. Jeannie Davies is asking about, is a unified we possible in group sizes larger than 150 people? I forget the study on connection, essentially thinking about how we are evolved for connection within smaller tribes. And I wanted to highlight that question because I think we've been thinking in linguistic and pedagogical terms and not as much in terms of the quantitative, but there is inherent in what we're talking about with elections, the question of majority, for example. So there's a numbers dimension here that we haven't touched on.
Yeah.
If either of you wants to take that
Yeah. I mean, Brooke, you look like you're about to say something.
Maybe I'll just, I think about this question a lot and scale. And my thinking has been, I was thinking, we've been writing about our conversation last week about, the fetishization of the seminar, the fetishization of the small, and the ways in which, public education at a grand scale. I think there is something about a certain size of people who can be in dialogue in real time, but there's also the syllabus, there's the the canon is a problem, but, what are these ways in which we scale beyond that in number of people who are in living together in embodied neighborhood life. And I think that, all I would say is a lot of the work that I've done in collaborations with Tina Segal and Asad Raza and Isabel Lewis and artists who are involved in live art has been about how you build the we in that very local moment, in real time where there's nothing given in advance. And can you build a set of concepts that will create that we imminent to that community, but it is limited. And then, but there are multiple we's in which we participate. And I think maybe that goes back to that question of the we and the they. The more we's we are part of, the harder it is to do we and they. And maybe that's a way of putting those two questions together.
Yeah. Huh. I don't know the social scientific literature about the study of 150 people or something, though that's kind of fascinating. But I think maybe something we could add to the conversation, and just as something to think about as we go forward, right? But are other aspirations that are related to the we. So aspirations, for example, towards the public or publicity. And I'm thinking about, for example, the Philosopher as a journal of public philosophy, right? As a journal, and like many others, that places a value on a certain kind of communication that is not addressed towards some disciplinarily specific community, right? So which is how someone who has no training in philosophy, right, finds interlocutors in a space like this and so forth. And I would imagine and hope that among the people who are here today, we have people from a lot of different kinds of backgrounds, fields, professions, and so forth, right? And I say that to say, there's a way in which the dream of the public, of the nation, of the world community, right, I think takes very seriously the fact that, we have things to say to many, many people beyond our we's or something like that. And certainly the aspiration, right, for public education to find ways in which, again, to communicate, to address, to bring as many people as possible into a particular kinds of conversation. It can't exactly be quantified, but the flip answer to the question is, but it's much more than 150, right? It's everybody that I can speak to in real time, and every reader, person, interlocutor that I can't anticipate, or something like that. There's something very, I think, profound and wonderful about that aspiration, but I think it's not better than or worse than the small seminar room, the meeting of three, all the other smaller, micro, and different scale communities.
Yeah, I'm gonna just bring into the conversation OHA Cranen's question, who said, PhD candidate in philosophy investigating the identity of the European Union. My question is about the scale of the we. What are your views on the possibilities of politically motivated identity building beyond historical and cultural boundaries? Is there a point beyond which the we becomes too diluted? And could you give some necessary components to constitute the we? So maybe, I think in some ways, this is echoing the question that we just asked, so maybe bookending it more than a new direction. But I do think that besides the question of whether there's necessary and sufficient conditions for we-ness, this idea that bigger we's are not necessarily better we's, right? We imagine that the more and more people we can bring on board, the more and more powerful that we will be. But there's also a power to the really condensed group, the affinity group or the family or the seminar, and that those scales of we can have are maybe the ones that, at least the ones of the family, the hardest bonds to break probably. Whereas the political affiliations are ones that we can move in and out of more easily, and that maybe we need to participate in all those kinds of we's. I think somebody's done a study that there's 3 kinds of loneliness. The kind of one of them is relational, one of them is lacking a community at that scale, and one of them is just having people to talk to. Anyway, so it would be interesting to approach the question of a we in terms of the inverse of the questions of loneliness. Okay, maybe we have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Is it possible that we only associate failure to the we if we think of it in a totalizing and authoritarian way? If we conceive the we in an agonistic sense, then it is not necessarily a failure, but a political condition, no? From Kelly Agra. So bringing back that question of failure.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would just say, because I know I used the word, I would say yes. I mean, like, I don't see failure. I think that when I say failure, I mean to say, I think what Kelly is saying about something that is agonistic and dynamic, right? That is impossible and necessary, to go back to Spivak's language on strategic essentialism. What one has to pursue, even though one will never get it. I think that we is something toward which to strive, right? I think that we is also something that we have to just keep checking ourselves and marking ourselves in every moment, right? When you make the claim, well, we voted for X, right? Who are we? I mean, in some sense, it's very simple. We're just, there's a way in which, and I think it's really on offer right now, if you, in any newspaper, again, because we're in the aftermath of the election, who do I mean, right? I mean, and this is something that I think, just to do a little disciplinary flagging, right? I think post-colonial studies, embattled as it is, and of course transhistorical and exceeding contexts far beyond the sort of South Asian Anglophone that I work in more specifically, has made one of its sort of foundational concerns, questions of, who can speak and for whom, right? In whose name? Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak, which I think is one of the most important teaching questions that we have, and very much of the spirit of Kiara's issue that she did for the Philosopher on questioning power, is absolutely about thinking about, in every moment that I try to speak for a we, right? I must check myself, and I must mark myself, and I must, and is that a really difficult space from which to speak? Yes. Right? But it is the ethical space. It is a space of integrity. It is a dynamic space, an agonistic space. So I think that's kind of what I mean by failure. And so in that sense, I'm totally in agreement with the questioner. I believe.
So if I may, let me end on this note that I'm going to try to weave together a couple different strands from a couple different people. In the chat, Graham Tiffany is asking, does the virus contest to the value of the we that we desire? And then there were 2 questions, one from Imke Brumer and one from Wafa Rashid, who are both in some ways worrying about the we, worrying that Wafa is worrying that globalization will produce a kind of monoculture we that will eradicate minority cultures or just cultures in general. And similarly, MK Brumer is saying there's always power involved, even when the we is active, even when one is actively or consensually identifying with that we. But that it's always that power aspect of it is inescapable. So I hope I'm not doing too much violence to the questions by putting those questions, that uncomfortableness with a we from Rafa and Imke together with Graham Tiffany's question, whether the virus is contesting the value of the we that we desire.
I mean, it makes me think of, if I could just say one thing that's been on my mind that Melissa Harris Perry said yesterday on the radio that I heard that I just thought it was so fantastic. Like, you know, a we in which it's okay to lose. A we in which losing the election doesn't mean the decimation of your standing as a citizen or your participation in the democracy as a, you know, or not even as a citizen, as a resident, as a member. And I think that maybe, you know, I mean, that's where power comes in. If it's not a, you know, when power means, or losing the election, you know, means the erosion of the basic, you know, the minimal thing that's needed for the we to be constituted, and for it not to be a we structured by pure domination. I don't know. I just thought that was so great. So I just put that out there. It's better than I can do.
Yeah. I mean, I would just mark that the fear of homogenization, which one of the questioners, I think, asked about, right, is an old and really important fear. And I think sort of the mid to late 20th century debates about what they called McWorlding and Coca-colonization and so forth are maybe worth revisiting in this moment, you know, in the sort of long moment of resurgent nationalisms and abortive projects of exporting capitalism and different modes of indigenizing, say, McDonald's and so forth. I think it's an interesting time to revisit, I guess that's all I'm saying, some of those earlier kinds of conversations. Like there was a moment, I think, in which some we, and, you know, flag that word again, some we was afraid, right, that America was going to, you know, export, you know, Baywatch and so forth everywhere, and everybody was just gonna, you know, become a different color copy of a certain mode of living and thinking, right? I'm talking about a different kind of version of an end of history discourse. And I don't think that came to pass, right? And so I just, you know, I think it'll be very interesting now that we are maybe not in exactly the same moment we thought we were in a week ago. It'll be interesting to see where we go from here, I think, in revisiting the recent past.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, something where the we is plastic and possible to be gently inhabited and gently in relationship with whatever falls outside of it. Thank you all to the questioners and to Anthony for putting this on, and so much thank you, Ragini and Brooke, for being here.
Thank you, Kiara. Thank you, Anthony.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you. Thank you, Ragini.
Thank you all for a really great conversation. Lots of great questions came in as well. I mean, there was luckily lots of angles that you guys took in your conversation, which links in nicely with the event tomorrow. So that's featuring Todd McGowan of the University of Vermont, who's recently written a book called Universality and Identity Politics. And so I think he starts from the strong critique of universalisms that you see in theorists like Foucault. So I'm just reading a bit from the essay he contributed. He said, Foucault writes, I start from the theoretical and methodological decision that consists in saying, let's suppose that universals do not exist. So I think McGowan's goal in the book is to reinvent universals according to a very different framework. So he'll be in discussion with another member of our editorial board, Jana Bacevic, who's recently moved to Durham, just up the road from me. And in fact, I met with her last week, so that was nice. We had a good chat about lots of different things. So anyway, that's all. So that event will be this time tomorrow, 2 o'clock your time, 7 o'clock my time. And there's lots of links to various things in the chat function, Ragini and Brooks and Kiara's homepages and Twitter accounts and all those things linked to the new issue, which I hope the discussion tonight has encouraged you to consider buying. And so I'll end by saying thank you to the three of you for a really great conversation, and to everyone else for tuning in. So,
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.